The most romantically named cigar in American history. Somewhere in a drugstore rack, tucked between lighters and lottery tickets, sits a cigar with the most romantic name in American tobacco history. Most people walk right past it. They don't know that this cigar once carried the weight of an empire, that its name was chosen to evoke the most famous love story in the ancient world, that it survived a revolution, a communist nationalization, and the collapse of an entire industry. And somehow, it's still sitting on that shelf today. This isn't the story of a cigar that vanished. It's stranger than that. This is the story of a cigar that never disappeared at all, and became forgotten anyway. By the end of this film, you'll understand how a brand can survive for over 140 years, outlast the country it was born in, and still slip so quietly out of cultural memory that almost no one now knows what it once meant. This is the story of Antonio y Cleopatra. Why this cigar matters. To understand why this brand matters, you have to understand what it represented before it became background noise. Antonio y Cleopatra is one of the oldest continuously produced cigar brand names in the United States, and most records trace it to 1879, making it a contemporary of brands like La Corona and Punch, names still spoken with reverence by collectors today. Some historical listings place its founding closer to 1888, and honestly, even cigar historians don't fully agree on the exact date. What almost everyone agrees on is this: it is old. Old enough to have been rolled by hand in Cuba, sold in the era of horse-drawn delivery carts, and smoked by generations of Americans before the word vintage meant anything to anyone. The name itself was the marketing masterstroke. In an era when cigar companies were racing to brand themselves with kings, generals, and aristocrats, this company reached even further back, to Marc Antony and Cleopatra, the Roman general and the Egyptian queen, whose love affair helped end a republic and birth an empire. Two profiles face to face, stamped into a coin-like medallion on every box. It wasn't just packaging, it was a promise. Smoke this, and you are holding a piece of the oldest, grandest love story in Western civilization. And it worked. For decades, Antonio y Cleopatra wasn't a drugstore afterthought. It was one of the best-selling natural wrapper cigars in the country, a brand so embedded in American life that its name became shorthand. People simply called it AYC, the way you'd nickname an old friend. But here's the part almost nobody knows. The origin story. The cigar was born in a world that no longer exists, a 19th century tobacco economy built on Cuban leaf, immigrant craftsmanship, and hand-rolling traditions passed down through families. Cuban-seed tobacco was the foundation, not grown in Cuba necessarily for every leaf, but descended from Cuban seed stock, the genetic lineage that cigar makers across the Caribbean and the American South prized above nearly everything else. The company built its identity on that lineage, wrapping it in natural leaf at a time when natural wrapper wasn't a marketing term. It was simply the only way cigars were made. Some accounts trace the founder to a Spanish immigrant working in the cigar trade in New York, chasing the same dream that pulled hundreds of tobacco families across the Atlantic and the Florida Straits in the late 1800s. Build something with your hands, put your story on the label, and let the smoke do the rest. But what's undisputed is the world this cigar was born into, a golden pipeline running from Cuban tobacco fields to hand-rolling factories to American smokers who treated a good cigar the way people today treat a good bottle of wine. In that world, a brand with a name this romantic, this theatrical, wasn't just going to survive, it was built to be remembered. For a while it was. The Golden Age. By the early to mid-20th century, Antonio y Cleopatra had become something bigger than a product. It had become a fixture, the kind of brand your grandfather's generation didn't even think of as a brand. It was just what a cigar was. The label itself became a small piece of American commercial art. Cigar box lids from this era, hunted by collectors today, show gilded, embossed scenes of Cleopatra reclining in a regal chair with Marc Antony at her side. The kind of ornate lithography that turned a cardboard box into something worth keeping long after the cigars inside were gone. That coin motif on the outside, two profiles pressed together like ancient currency, became instantly recognizable on tobacconist counters across the country. The brand eventually came under the umbrella of the American Tobacco Company's cigar operations, part of the vast consolidation that reshaped the American tobacco industry in the early 1900s. This was the era when a handful of massive tobacco conglomerates absorbed dozens of once independent cigar names, folding family brands into corporate portfolios almost overnight. For Antonio y Cleopatra, that meant scale, wider distribution, a permanent place in humidors and drugstore counters from coast to coast. But scale is a double-edged blade in the cigar world. The bigger a brand becomes, the more it has to protect, and the harder it becomes to reverse course when the ground shifts beneath it, and the ground was about to shift completely. The hidden story. Here's what most casual cigar drinkers never learn. This brand's real turning point wasn't a slow fade. It was a political earthquake. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution swept through Cuba. Within a few years, the new government began nationalizing private industries, and the cigar business, one of the island's most valuable exports, was directly in the crosshairs. Cuban-owned tobacco factories, family operations that had rolled cigars for generations, were seized by the state. For American-owned cigar brands with roots in Cuban production, this wasn't a business setback. It was existential. Almost overnight, companies that had built their entire identity on Cuban leaf and Cuban craftsmanship had to answer an impossible question. How do you keep making the same cigar when the country that defined it is suddenly closed off? Antonio y Cleopatra, like so many other brands with Cuban origins, faced this exact crossroads. Production had to migrate. The story, consistent across cigar historians and retailers alike, points to Puerto Rico as the new home, where the brand transitioned toward machine production using Cuban-seed tobacco grown outside Cuba itself. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told. The loss wasn't really about Castro seizing a factory. It was about an entire generation of American cigar brands quietly, permanently severing their most authentic ingredient, access to Cuban soil, and having to reinvent themselves around an embargo that, decades later, still hasn't been lifted. But there was a second, quieter transformation happening at the same time, and this one had nothing to do with politics. The fall. As the 20th century wore on, American tastes were changing. The post-war boom that had made cigar smoking a mainstream, everyday habit for millions of American men began to give way to new pressures, cigarette dominance, shifting health attitudes, and eventually a boutique cigar renaissance in the 1990s that redefined what premium meant. That renaissance created a split in the cigar world that still defines it today. On one side, small batch, hand-rolled boutique brands from Nicaragua, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic, chasing the prestige that Cuban cigars once held exclusively. On the other side, legacy names like Antonio y Cleopatra, which had already made the leap to machine production for consistency and affordability, and found themselves permanently boxed into a different category: the everyday cigar, the value cigar, the cigar you grab without ceremony. Ownership of the brand moved through the corporate tobacco world over the following decades, passing through American brands, later Consolidated Cigar Corporation, then Altadis USA, before landing with ITG Brands, one of the largest cigar manufacturers operating in the United States today. Each corporate handoff kept the brand alive, but each one also moved it further from the romantic, handmade origin story printed right there on its own box. The name still promised Antony and Cleopatra. The product, by the late 20th century, was mass-produced in a factory in Cayey, Puerto Rico, sold by the dozen for a few dollars a stick. This is the quiet tragedy at the center of the story. The brand didn't die. It simply stopped being extraordinary, and extraordinary is the only thing collectors and historians tend to remember: the collector's hunt. And yet, walk into any serious Tabaxiana collector's home, and you'll find something surprising. Antonio y Cleopatra material is quietly, stubbornly desirable. Not the modern cigars themselves, those are inexpensive and easy to find. It's the older material that collectors chase. Vintage cigar boxes from the mid-20th century, their lids still carrying that gilded, embossed scene of Cleopatra and Antony in full classical regalia. These boxes turn up in estate sales and antique shops, prized less for what they once held, and more as artifacts of a nearly vanished era of commercial lithography. A time when a cardboard cigar box was treated as a genuine piece of decorative art. For collectors, the appeal isn't rarity in the traditional sense. This wasn't a limited release Cuban cohiba locked in a government vault. The appeal is historical density. A single Antonio y Cleopatra box from the 1940s or 50s is a physical artifact connecting three different eras: the golden age of hand-rolled Cuban cigars, the mid-century corporate consolidation of American tobacco, and the eventual industrial migration to Puerto Rico after the embargo. That's rare in the collecting world. An object humble enough to have survived by the thousands, yet layered enough in history to reward anyone who actually stops to look closely at it. The legacy and final reveal. So why does a cigar most people have never really noticed still deserve to be remembered? Because Antonio y Cleopatra's story isn't really about tobacco. It's about what survival costs. Most legendary Cuban-rooted cigar brands from the 19th century met one of two fates. Either they vanished completely when Cuban production was nationalized, existing today only in auction catalogs and museum collections, or they clung to prestige by staying small, expensive, and exclusive, becoming the boutique legends collectors chase at auction for hundreds of dollars a box. Antonio y Cleopatra took a third path that almost no one talks about. It chose to keep existing, at scale, at low cost, without ceremony, for 140 uninterrupted years. It survived Castro. It survived the embargo. It survived cigarette culture, the health scares of the 1960s, the boutique cigar boom, and half a dozen corporate acquisitions. It is, by any honest measure, one of the most resilient brand names in the entire history of American tobacco. And that resilience is exactly why it got forgotten. A cigar that disappears becomes a legend. A cigar that survives by quietly blending into the drugstore shelf becomes invisible. Some brands are erased by history. This one simply learned how to hide inside it. A coin-stamped medallion of Antony and Cleopatra, still pressed into a cigar box today in a Puerto Rican factory. More than a century and a half after two lovers' names were first chosen to sell a stranger's tobacco, It never disappeared. You just stopped noticing it was still there.